All right, we're live. Cool. So we wrapped up the Dungeon World Hunt for the Black Stallions game, which was only 3 sessions, but we had 6 episodes in the actual show. And Lee and I are going to talk about what it was like to play that game and run that game, and talk about maybe some advice for other people who are interested in running role-playing games, and kind of what we learned from it and what we've kind of experienced otherwise. That's the thesis of this paper that I hope that you will please give me my graduate degree. So
sounds good to me.
Yeah. Cool. So that was Dungeon World. I know that was the first game of Dungeon World you ran, and I've only run... At that point, I had only run maybe one other one, maybe 2 other ones. So certainly not many. So I was also kind of a novice to that system as well. So what did you think of that system, first of all, as someone running a game?
I like the system a lot. I think it is a lot like many of the Powered by the Apocalypse games, except crunchier. So there's something for players of more traditional role-playing games there to sink their teeth into.
Okay. I always found with that... I found with Dungeon World, one of the things that's tough is those 7 to 9 results. Like when they're trying to do something, they're trying to defy danger in this way or that way, and of course they roll an 8, they roll a 9, they roll a 7, and then you're like, okay, shit, how do I still give you this thing and also not... how do I make sure that you succeeded, but make it interesting?
Yeah. The latter piece of it is definitely the hardest part. I think when I was preparing for this game, I had sort of like a stock set of possible responses for a 7 through 9 roll, like, oh, you lose your weapon, or your armor is damaged, or things like that, things that could apply to any situation. I do think, though, that, like you said, making it interesting is the most important thing. So something contextual is generally going to be better than something preloaded. That said, like it gives you, I think, additional confidence as a GM if you have something just ready to go.
Yeah, we had played a game a while back with a guy who his response was always just to deal damage. So whenever there was a 7 to 9 roll, it was always, okay, well, you suffer some damage. Like, you don't fall off the cliff, but because of enough rocks falling down and whacking you in the head, you take 4 damage. So that was always his 7 to 9 go-to, was you take some damage. And it was easy to understand, but it never really pushed the story. I don't know if you feel the same way about... I know that isn't what we did, but I don't know if you'd feel the same way about that.
Well, I think, like, we've played a few of these games now where we have the Powered by the Apocalypse system, these sort of ambiguous 7 to 9 rolls, and one of the options there is you can take damage. But it's funny because I think I really avoided that in Black Stallions, and I think you've avoided it in a few of the games we played. And so sometimes you'll be sitting there for like minutes trying to come up with what it is, and then you're like, oh yeah, I can always just hurt the player. And so I think it should still be an option, and not even necessarily an option of last resort. It just shouldn't be repetitive. Like, there are times when taking damage makes sense. But if you're just rolling a 7 to 9 on, like, I don't know, your navigation roll or something like that, it really doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, that was tough. At times we'd also... One of the stock things that I would go to is like that you lose something in the process. Like, oh, you've got to hurry and get through this. There's a tunnel and you've got to hurry and get through it before the chittering goblin hordes tear you limb from limb. Okay, well, you rolled a 7. You're going to get through, but you have to leave something behind. And one of the slightly annoying things is, especially in shorter games, the characters often don't have enough stuff that really matters that much to them.
Yeah.
To where it's like, oh, I guess I leave behind my dungeon rations, but this game's going to be so short. how much am I going to need those?
Yeah, yeah, that has come up in a few different contexts.
And in a game that has yet to be published that I played with my cousins, one thing that kept happening was characters would be like, I guess I lose all my clothes. So then they're
That's
just
funny.
like nude doing whatever. Like, okay, I guess. And so, yeah, if they're characters who aren't like very armored fighters or whatever, where it's like, oh, I just have these clothes. Yeah, I'm just naked now. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I just re-listened to the episode where the characters encounter the bone dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like two of them ended up naked after getting hit with the breath weapon. But I thought that kind of made sense, honestly. Like I was happy with that outcome.
Did you like the bone dragon sound effects, by the way?
Yeah, I did.
It was
Yeah.
just me dropping Jenga tiles
Oh,
and
that's
like
funny.
fucking around with Jenga tiles. And for a second, when I was recording that and like editing it, I should say, I thought to myself, should I just get a bunch of chicken bones? And then I was like, no, that's the kind of thing that a witch thinks. I'm not there yet. Like, okay, back off, buddy.
That's funny. It's like your method acting role playing.
Yeah, exactly. I had to put on my chainmail. But yeah, I really enjoyed the Black Stallions game. I was wondering, since if to Jeremy and Jeff, the two listeners of the podcast, to the few people who do listen, they might be confused that that was a continuation kind of a game that we had played that you ran a few years back, our Pathfinder game. That was also a lot of fun. And we were the various Black Stallion characters. So we played Gellin and Rook and Brody. And what was Carl's character's name again? I do not remember.
Kaylin Weatherspear.
Kaylin Weatherspear. Which, yeah, okay. Yeah. And so there were a chunk of references to that game. Did you find it... Did you run into any like challenges when it came to how to reference back to this stuff while still making it like its own story? And especially because David did not play that game with us. He was new to that whole scene.
Yeah, I think for me, the references back was more to sort of close out a loop in my head as opposed to do lots of fan service for the players, because you know I think most people who play these games, like, Alex couldn't remember any of the game.
Yes, yeah.
And Carl, I think, remembered like pieces of it, but not a lot. I mean, I think they're fond memories, but you don't really remember the details. You more remember like moods and silly encounters and that sort of thing. And so I was less worried about being faithful to the old game, or even like having a coherent reference now. I was more just sort of like trying to sprinkle in some color from the prior games, if only because like that, I have a bad habit with games of not finishing them. And I think that, this served as sort of a farewell to that game as well.
I think that was a pretty good farewell to that. I thought it was cool. And I forget if you had told us in advance that it was going to be kind of a continuation of the Black Stallions game.
I hadn't, but I think I asked various people various details about things so that I could reconstruct it in a way. Like, I like the idea of you see it in like Marvel Cinematic Universe and things like that, this like multiverse approach where you'll see sort of characters from different movies in like other movies, and kind of like that approach with role playing, the idea that you build this huge world and you build all these characters, and then you don't just like put them in a box and never use them again. Like, ideally you find ways to breathe new life into them. And like in the Black Stallions game, there was like the Bone Weevil character who was like sort of a throwaway NPC in the Pathfinder game, like the crazy goblin. And he made an appearance in this game as well. And it's just fun to bring back like sort of NPCs that the characters have in many ways like made three-dimensional.
Yeah. At the end of the game, so in the second, there were 3 sessions. In the second session, at the end, we ran into Gellin, one of the Black Stallions, who was like the keeper of that mystical library. And then at the end of the final episode, we run into Rook. And there's kind of a reveal that you had, which was, Rook was the reason that all of us came on this quest. That he, as like a master of disguise or shapeshifter or whatever, had essentially been all of the people who had hired us or convinced us to go on this quest. Was there one of the things I've had trouble with in running games is that element of like, I'm going to say conspiracy. That might not fully be the best word, but for like, there's been this plot going on this whole time and now it's revealed. And there's too many times where in longer games, the plot just this conspiracy either plods out so slowly that by the time it's revealed, we've forgotten a lot of the earlier stuff.
Yeah.
The L5R game was a great example of that, but since it was so incredibly long, it felt like we lost a lot of the elements that were there. In high school, we played both L5R and Vampire a lot. And there were times I thought that like conspiracies, if they were there, were so dragged out that you lost the thread entirely, or there was just so much extra shit going on that it was like, I can't worry about a conspiracy. There's an ogre right next to me. That's more important.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, of like kind of having a big plot or a conspiracy to reveal at the end for somebody?
Yeah, I do. I do think it relates to how much prep you do in these games, and I think like in the older style of like Vampire the Masquerade type games, they would sort of lend themselves to these like conspiracies within conspiracies, and you'd have like a lot of this stuff plotted out, and then either would never come to fruition, or you'd have your big reveal, and people would be like, "Wait, who is that? Why should I care?" And so I think like. In the Powered by the Apocalypse games, you don't really do that nearly as much. And like with this, I had it set up that way, but I didn't care that much. Like in the end, like the final confrontation is whatever the players kind of want it to be. And so, I think I left it a little ambiguous whether Rook was actually all those things, or if he was just trying to sort of like lie to you to throw you off balance at the very end. And like, I think you in particular, maybe it was you in particular, but sort of like resisted the idea that he was, the person who sort of like sent you on this mission in the first instance. And so to me, it wasn't super important. But I think in general, when you have like the big reveal, or you're trying to lay breadcrumbs for some kind of conspiracy or overarching plot, I think you need to do it sparingly, but at least have a few details that you can sort of call back to, and then be flexible about the final outcome. Like not hinge everything on that.
Okay. I got two things about that. So you say to be flexible at the end. I'm wondering, Rook had been offering the characters like, okay, if you essentially get these crystals bound to you, that can kind of save. Somebody's outside my house honking their horn. Like if you get these crystals bound to you, that can kind of not save the world, but prevent this great calamity from occurring. Did you have an idea in your head of like, okay, if these guys take that, what that's going to look like? Or was it just going to be like, did you have any thoughts in regard to that, of like a different road that could have gone down?
Yeah, although it was like so much earlier. So basically when I was like coming up with the idea for the game originally, what I wanted to do is essentially revive a lot of the stuff that I plotted out for the original Pathfinder game. And so there was sort of like these fleeting references to like this Lich King and the big bad, basically. And so I think if you guys had gone that route, there would have been more games, and then there would have been a bigger bad to confront. But didn't really work out that way, and I'm glad it didn't, because I think it was much more contained this way.
Okay. The other thought I had as we were talking about this, I can remember in games we played in high school, and even some of the other games, like the Rome game. We played a Vampire the Masquerade game that took place kind of in ancient Rome. We played a game that took place in Tampa, a game that took place in DC, and I can remember running stuff for David and Alex in Orlando, and I would write so much shit in advance. The Apocalypse World system really pushes you to not do that. Did you find that to be like a jarring difference, or what are your thoughts on that? Like the level of prep that you put into this compared to other things, and like how that affected the game?
So I think that the level of, I think you can put in a ton of prep even into the Powered by the Apocalypse games, but I think the way in which you prepare for it is almost like building like a D&D module or something like that. You remember like those old adventure books where it's like, now you go in this room and there's this puzzle and there's these bad guys and there's this treasure, like sort of plotting out the kinds of content that they might come across. Not necessarily like the way in which they come across it in a specific order and like all those things, but just having those things at your fingertip. I don't find that as interesting as like the larger plot or the larger lore or things like that. And so I end up spending a lot of my time and energy thinking about those things, even though those are the things, at least in the Powered by the Apocalypse systems, that the players should be sort of generating as like you play to find out. So they come across it on their own terms. And so I think there's a disconnect for me there, because for me, I think the world building is one of the most fun things about playing these games, and it should be shared. But I also think like the more someone has thought about it, the more you can just like build this unique world together. And I don't know that the Powered by the Apocalypse world always lends itself to that.
One of the things that we had in the L5R game was we ran into the story that we were trying to tell butting heads with the system. I think Dungeon World is like much more cohesively put together than what we were doing. We were using a variation of the Powered by the Apocalypse system that someone had made and had kind of play tested and kind of, I think, stopped working on that.
Yeah.
Brandon Taylor of Galileo Games, I think, is who made that. But we were then using a box set that was this crazy, super conspiracy oriented. Like, here's all these things, here's all these secrets, everybody has all this, there's all this intrigue. And one of the problems I ran into was in the Powered by the Apocalypse system, you can just ask whatever, basically. And so for a long time, I was like holding back information because I found myself fighting against the system. So to tell the story about these like deep secrets that it's going to take a lot of work to uncover, and not just be like, well, you rolled a 9, so you get one question. Oh, fuck, you unraveled it. You pulled the one thread. Damn it.
I guess on that, I would just say don't be afraid to let your players explode your best laid plans. Like if they roll the 9 or whatever, they're going to get so much satisfaction if they do feel like they've exploded your best laid plans. And as a player, that's what I'm constantly trying to do. I'm constantly thinking to myself, like, how can I screw this up?
I knew it all along, you son of a bitch. I knew it the whole time. I've known you for 20 years, and we finally got it on tape.
Well, it's just that, like, when you're playing a video game, you'll be, like, going around the level, and you'll be like, oh, a sign. Here's a sign for, like, the office. You go into the office, and it's, like, this carefully laid laid out level design. And it'd be like, here's a sign for the living quarters. Oh, the living quarters door is locked. You can't go in there. And you can't go in there because it hasn't been created, right? Nobody's spent the time to build that. In a role-playing game, you can go anywhere. And so like when you're off the grid, like that's some of the most fun you can have as a player, I think.
I can definitely agree with that. I think especially in games um where we're trying to like have humor like factor into the game more, which I think this game that was the case very much. I think at games where we're trying to have humor factor into things more, I think that works actually very, very well, because it's like, all right, well, what are these? Let's check out the bathroom. Oh, what's the bathroom like in this place? And you can kind of just do something that's, well, maybe not meaningful to the plot. It can still be fun and it can still be funny to listen to. I think that at times when you're trying to get like more serious and have like a different mood, at times we can run into those issues. And I think at times we were telling a very in this game, I think at times we were telling a very serious story about these like dark forces and forbidden knowledge. And at other times we were like going wild, where it's like, oh, now you're in New York and there's a goblin that wants to piss on books, and there's a guy who worships two glowing balls of light. Did you have any thoughts on like the tone and some of like the like changes in tone that we ran into?
I think we all, we always start out and we're like, this game we're going to be more serious, and I just don't really think that that's how our players interact with one another, and so I think that's fine. I do think that some game systems lend themselves more to seriousness than others. Like Vampire the Masquerade is so dark that it's hard to just be all jokey when you're like creating flesh golems and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think with like Dungeon World, I was much more prepared to just sort of roll with the punches on it. I think the other side of it, and this is something I've been interested to talk to you about for a while, is like the degree to which in a game like players are creating content versus the GM is creating content. And so like I think this game was a little slow to start, and I was very nervous at the very beginning. And it's almost like when you pick up a new book and you start reading that book, you have no idea what's going on at the very beginning. You don't know who the main character is. You don't know like the world that he's in. You've read like maybe 10 pages and you're still like, I have no idea what's going on. That's how it is like anytime you're starting out a role-playing game too. And until the players, I think, feel warmed up and then start spitballing with one another, you're just sort of like spoon feeding them. You're like, okay, now what do you do? Do you do X? Do you do Y? Do you do Z? Just because like they're never really like taking up the ball and running with it at the beginning. But once things like kick off, then it's great. And I think like one of the things that made this Black Stallions game so great is like you would have characters, sort of players building off one another's ideas and just spending a lot of time where basically they're doing all the work and you're just sitting back and kind of like watching it and being almost like a referee, like jumping in here and there to like keep things flowing.
I could agree with that. I think in that game, it really kicked up in like its, I'm going to say intensity, but I don't mean like emotional intensity, but I think it really, really got going in that second session. Like once we got into that library, I think we had a better idea of who these characters were. We were kind of dealing more with the characters in the serious capacity of like Carl's character having to come face to face with the idea of like, oh, you were this freed, essentially mystical slave, and now you have someone bound to you as a slave. How do you respond to that? What does that mean? Alex's character though he immediately afterwards got involved in like hacking Gellin apart pretty quickly. But he like, oh, here's this information about your faith that you hold very dearly and how you can now view it in a different light, not to do a dumb play on words there. But I think that really kind of kicked stuff up. And so I could agree with you that like it takes a while to get those characters down. And I can say in the game that we're playing currently, the Monster of the Week game, soon to be released, soon, maybe months and months. In that game, some of the NPCs, I just had them. I didn't have almost any idea of who they were, and it took a while for them to keep coming back to have any idea of who they were, or I'd have an idea, and then if I'd ask you guys like, how does this work? You would tell me something, and I was like, I meant for this character to be a joke, and now you're having them rip out somebody's eyeballs? Okay, well, maybe they're not a joke anymore. Maybe they're much, much more dark than I thought they were. So I would agree with you and even say that like the NPCs and like my ideas of the plot throughout a game will often change as time goes on. And I think that in longer games, it's less important in short games, but in longer games, there are even times where you need to just bail on a plot line.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had in the L5R game, I've talked about this in one of the other reflections, but there was this whole plot about these like petty criminals who were pretending to be mystical ninja. And so anytime like an unexplained crime would occur, they would take credit for it and be like, oh yeah, that was us, the secret evil ninja with magical powers. You better do what we say. So they were just trying to intimidate people with that mystique. And in the end, they didn't really matter. And I really wish that I had not even bothered giving them any time of day. And when I felt that they weren't important, I wish I had earlier on thrown it out.
Interesting.
And instead I let it go till maybe like what in the episodes was the 6th episode to the very end. And there were almost 50 episodes, but towards the 6th episode from the end, I was like, okay, here's this, you guys solving this plot. And in the end, it just wasn't that important. And it's like, okay, that would have maybe gone all right early on to say, well, actually the stuff you did, not that big of a thing. But at this point, then why fucking bother with it?
So I remember like in, I think the Bradenton game, there came a point where you were sort of like, okay, this game has to end.
Yeah.
And you had this sort of like temptation to try to tie up all the loose ends.
Mm-hmm.
But there are like a million loose ends. Just like, like here's a fire genie who was in the game like for 2 episodes. And, you know, here's this demon character. And it's like, so are you saying with the ninja that like you should have just dropped it, or you should have tied up the loose end earlier?
Ideally, with that game, I would have liked to have tied up that loose end earlier. I wish I had just realized this isn't going to go anyplace. Let's just tie this up, and you can have the characters then go, oh, there's more important things to focus on and much bigger fish to fry. We'll focus on that and stop wasting time with this. And but even without that, maybe it just being a mystery, I don't like loose ends hanging out. Like when we finish stuff up, I do like everything to be kind of tied up together in a nice little bow, and for you to go, okay, I get it. Even so much so that some of at the end of that L5R game, which ran for a very long time, David and I went back and recorded some epilogues to further tie up some stuff. So it was like the game had ended actually. And just when I was editing the last episode, then I was like, wait, we never explained what happened to this guy. Let's go back and figure that out. We never explained what happened to this person. Let's figure that out. And we tried to tie some of those together that otherwise wouldn't have been like, didn't get fully explained. I think when you're playing a game like the ones that we played in high school that were kind of all the hell over the place, one of the problems you have is you have so many loose ends. Because you're kind of running around and doing whatever, and it can become tough. And in that case, I think there are times where it's all right to just drop a plot line and just drop a thread, like a story thread or a story element, and just say like, all right, well, we never did find out what was down that well. And like, oh, maybe later on in some other game we'll discuss it, or it'll come back, or it'll come up in some other way. But if it's really, yeah, I think part of that comes down to figuring out the story that you want to tell.
Yeah.
And not like the exact storyline, but the theme and the general motifs. And if there's something that doesn't really fit in it that well, if it was a brief distraction, that's okay. But like there can be a movie about a conspiracy that's really, really intense, and there can be a car chase in it, but it doesn't mean the movie becomes about car chases. And like, I think at times I will often feel like, hold on, well, I have to explain exactly why the bad guy had these really, really good drivers that could chase the main characters. And like, okay, Austin, just chill out, drop that shit.
Yeah, I think like on the high school game point, like I remember that Tampa game, it had so much stuff in it, and a lot of it was just like, oh, I read this like source book on Mage the Ascension or something like that. Let me like, how can I sock in some of this into there? And so it just becomes like this weird grab bag of like everything you've read in the past 6 months or something like that, and not necessarily anything coherent.
Oh yeah, definitely. That happened when we were when Trevor and I were running that Bradenton game. It just more stuff kept getting thrown in and thrown in and thrown in.
I mean, that's the ultimate example of that, I think.
Oh yeah, of just like anytime it's like, I read one of these werewolf books. Now you guys have to fight a werewolf. I read a book about wizards. Now you have to fight a wizard. Like, it just kept getting crazy. I know one of the many critiques both you and I and David have had of me, and how I run games, is that I often, at least in the past, would tend to not reward players enough. What do you have any advice for people running games in regard to like rewarding players, whether it's like mechanically or through storyline stuff, or just advice on that subject? Because too often I felt when I would play games, I would almost just be punishing you guys constantly. You'd go into a room and it'd be like, haha, idiots, you didn't see the ninja in the room. They shoot arrows at you. Haha, fools, the Nosferatu come out of the sewers and grab you. Like, that would happen constantly. And so every moment would be you guys like hobbling away from a fight that you had not won, and we would just have to come back and deal with later. So what even happened?
Yeah, I think that, to me, I don't think it really matters like whether you're rewarding your players like with items or like plot lines or whatever. I think that the lens that I look at it through is player agency. And so, you know, if you're substantially in control of the game and you're just sort of shuffling players from, you know, menagerie to menagerie that you've created, saying like, isn't this a cool scene that I set up? You know, isn't this a cool puzzle that has only one solution? Like, and in the case of the ninja, it's like, yeah, you had to have Auspex 1 or something like that, or your wand of like destroying 3 ninjas. And I just say generally, like, if your players are driving the story, then your game is going to be successful, because like at its heart, I think that's what a role-playing game is, right? It's like, it's a group storytelling. Whereas if it's you just sort of like pulling people around by the nose, it's going to be a failure, because you know, ultimately I think the players will be frustrated by that. And I think one measure of success that your games have had, especially relative to the early games, is now you have players who will voluntarily walk into failure, right? And so like, I think we played an L5R game where like at the end, my character just killed himself. And we had one where like, because they had failed to protect this woman or something like that. And then, yeah, like sort of similar thing in the most recent game, the Fox game that we ran with Carl, or the Familiars game that we ran with Carl, where it's like, I don't want to give any spoilers away in case we air that one. But basically, like you have players doing very like risky and even things against their own interest, and it's because they want to drive the story along and play to find out what happens. And I think like if you focus on player agency, that's where you're gonna see the greatest benefits, I think.
Yeah, I feel that's always, as a player, always much easier in short games to be like, okay, I'm going to do this nuts thing, or I'm going to do this thing that so obviously is dangerous. But in longer games, even if I'm trying to really play this character well, I do feel like a larger degree of hesitance to like kind of just jump for it right away. And I wonder when I'm running games, when it comes to consequences, David and I talked about this for the L5R game about like player death, like having players, like when a character well, hopefully not player death, but character death. That's what I mean. PC death. Not that like, oh, you know, Carl, he got real sick. No,
we got to play the next game in person, guys.
Yeah. We're going to play this next game while all of us are trying to drive a car at the same time. Where you have, there are times in like a story where it seems like the relevant thing would be for someone to die or for a character to go away as at least like a main character. And in these big giant ensemble casts where you have like people coming and going in like a Game of Thrones type situation, you can have that in part because those characters can easily get replaced. Like their death can be important and have meaning, and then other folks become more important almost. So like it's a big deal in Game of Thrones when Robb Stark gets killed and Catelyn Stark gets killed. But the show doesn't stop there, and it keeps going, and in fact introduces other characters that we like hang around with for a while beyond that, or near around to that time. Do you have any thoughts on that when it comes to games? Because oftentimes I find myself not bending over backwards, but almost like really having to jump through some hoops in some games, especially that are supposed to be more serious or more gritty and supposed to be longer, to be like, okay, how is it that you just straight up don't get killed as a consequence of what's going on?
Yeah. So like one advice for good writing in like television writing is that you kill your sacred cows. And I think like a lot of shows don't do that, and they get very stale after a while. So like if you're watching like Community or something like that, it's a great show, but it has like these, you know, maybe 5 main characters, something like that. And they just end up doing the same stuff over and over and over again. And it's so repetitive. And the first few times things happen with those characters, it's really interesting. But after a while, you've sort of seen everything you can see about those characters. And then like toward the end of that show, like the actors start bailing on the show because they've become more successful, and they keep trying to like cobble together, repeating what they used to do. Similar with like Friends, like any sort of long running show, for the most part, it like really suffers after a while. And it's because like the writers didn't kill their sacred cows, right? They can't like move or change. And I think Game of Thrones is a great example of an ensemble cast, but also a set of characters that change. And in order for that change to happen, there must be sacrifice. And that includes like sacrificing characters. And I've always loved the idea of seeing that in games, especially in long running games. I think I've never run a game that's so long that we've been able to encompass that. But like I specifically tried to work in mechanisms in certain old games where like, okay, if your character dies, you'll be playing this character or something like that. And it'll be a character that the player has had a lot of involvement with and a lot of input into. And I just think that that would be a great model. I think when it comes to consequences, it shouldn't be so much system consequences where it's like, well, you were fighting these 10 ninjas, and the system says you can only beat them if you bring your wand of killing 10 ninjas, and because you didn't, now you have to die. I think the consequence must be that you foreshadow to the player that if he's going to take a certain action, there's a substantial risk. And then also, like, in terms of making it consequential, like, if say the player decides to do that, well, I'm going to sacrifice myself to save this other character, or to advance the plot in a certain way. You should allow that player to like make that death have meaning. And I think if you can do those things, it could probably be like some of the most effective storytelling in a game. But I think the transition's difficult. And candidly, I don't think it's something we've really been successful at.
Yeah, we had in the L5R game, we ran into an issue where David had. Ooh, can you hear my stomach?
No.
Oh, too bad. It had a lot to say. In the L5R game, we reached a point where David's character was so enmeshed in these conspiracies, where he was like tied in with the Scorpion drug cartels. Then the Colot had started to kind of like try to tell him, you need to be doing what we say, or else we can or else kind of a thing. And so he was so bound up by all these things. We reached a point where his character couldn't change. His character basically got hemmed in or roped in, to the point where he's like, I don't see how this character could realistically do a lot anymore. It seems like this character's kind of run their course. And since they've run their course, when he like failed a roll, and I was like, maybe this happens. Maybe your character doesn't make it out of this. And we decided that could work out, and we used it as an opportunity to kind of like reveal some stuff that had not otherwise been able to be revealed, that like up to then everybody had been kind of hitting brick walls, where it's like, okay, well, he died, and since this was the second murder in this pattern, well, then that allowed a pattern to be established that we could follow back to the source. And one of his regrets was that it happened so late. He was like, I almost wish that happened earlier, so then the second character that I played could have had more meaning and could have developed more. And instead it was like, okay, well, we have, I think it was like 3 episodes or 4 episodes till the very end, and I'm playing this guy who just shows up and is like, all right, I'm the person at the end here.
It's like the Dax, Esri Dax coming in at the end of Deep Space Nine.
That is a good way to put it, where you're like, okay, there's something to this character, but not that much.
Yeah. I think that, well, I agree it should happen earlier, but I think it's hard to control that. I think if you have teed up, a potential transition character, then like there's maybe some of those concerns are diminished, because you can sort of begin to see how they've already been changing and that sort of thing.
I think that's a good actually piece of advice, is if a character dies and the player's going to be then playing an additional character, have it be someone we've already seen, rather than be like, and I'm the new guy, I'm cousin Jeffrey, welcome, kind of a deal. Cool. Well, the last thing that I can think of that I think would be worthwhile would be just to ask, since you and I have been playing these games to one degree or another for 20 years with one another, how have you noticed since we've been recording these, how has that kind of changed stuff up? Because long ago we had talked about trying to take notes on these games and write stories about them, or turn them into a book, or turn them into something else. And now we're recording them, and eventually they're getting aired as podcasts. Like, what are your thoughts on that business? Aside from, it's a fruitless endeavor, Austin. Stop wasting time, effort, and money.
Yeah, that goes without saying.
Absolutely.
I think I'm ambivalent about it. I think I was very hesitant at the beginning, because I thought that for me, playing these games is just like a chance to spend time with friends. And I thought that it would bring some artificiality into it and maybe just chill how people react or how people speak. And I was reluctant on that. And also, I think I've always been a bit embarrassed playing role-playing games. And so the idea that, it's out there for anyone to see, particularly when you're like, playing a, Zap Brannigan inspired like Space Cadet or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. Like so many opportunities to just look like a complete idiot. So like that was part of it. But honestly, like after listening to like, I think the first game you sent around, I was like, oh, this is so great. It's so great to just be able to revisit this thing and to see it from different angles. It just makes you appreciate it a lot more. And I think like it will have a huge nostalgia value as time goes on to have memorialized those games. I think that the radio play aspect to it does add some artificiality to it. I do think it does take away from the sort of player agency and player driven side of things, because you want it to be more consumable. And it's almost like anytime you try to make something digestible, you also like cheapen and coarsen it in a way. And so, I think that that's a danger. But I don't think it's a big danger. Like, I think it adds much more than it takes away.
The way I always one way I always viewed role-playing games, that if you had a session that didn't go very well, I always thought about it as almost imagine you did an improv performance for no audience. It was just the people in the improv troupe. Mm-hmm. And if you had kind of a shitty or off day, it was just the 4 or 5 or however many of you are in an improv troupe. And you're the only ones who saw it. And so you noticed and critiqued the shit out of exactly what you did and kind of felt down about it. If you at least had an audience, even if it wasn't the best show, it was still a show that was put on for them. You still did create something for those people. And so like one of the things I value about recording these is that even if they're not the best, so even in some sessions that are like, these are a little weak, if it's at least moving the story forward or further developing these characters, I feel that like for the tiny audience of mostly just me editing the episode later, like at least it's something that was created that later on can be not only built off of, but is like lasts or remains. And I think that that at times for me undercuts the sting of if the session wasn't the world's most fun.
Yeah, I really agree with you when it comes to like, what we're doing here is creating something. And even if the thing that you're creating is like the most navel gazing thing around, like it's not something that there's ever going to be like a huge audience for or anything like that. I think it's such a great instinct to cultivate, because like in general, you can go through life and just consume and sit in front of a TV and just sort of slowly die. Or you can, at every opportunity, barth forth apocalyptica, right? Like you're just constantly spinning forth new things. And I think that that's a really good impulse. And I think that's like one of the joys of these role-playing games. And I think that creative energy, you kind of take it with you into other aspects of your life as well.
That's pretty cool. I think that's actually a pretty good inspiring moment to end on there in that conversation.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you very much, Leigh. I appreciate it.
All right, Austin.
Let me end the recording.